Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined with me, as always, by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. Folks, we have a great Week 15 Thursday show for you. We're going to be talking about the fantasy rankings of mine that vary quite a bit from consensus, both above and below. Ryan's going to quiz me on some of those, and I'll give a little bit of reasonings behind it. From there, we will dive into some sneaky Week 15 flex plays. We'll talk about a good quarterback streamer. I'm going to ask Ryan some defense questions because we've had a lot of injuries on the defensive side of the ball, and most people aren't talking about it, and I want to get to the bottom of this. And then finally, Ryan's going to outline how he sees the AFC playoff picture shaping out because, folks, there are 6 teams right now that are 7-6. I don't believe it has ever been closer in the AFC at this point in the season. Ryan, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, Josh, I went through your fantasy rankings, and the first disparity I found is one that I'm very enthusiastic about myself. I'm going to play him with some money on the line this week. You have Matthew Stafford as quarterback 3. He's quarterback 7 in consensus. Why are you so high in Stafford, Josh?
Yeah, I think when we do our DFS player pool, he's going to be towards the top. Matthew Stafford's now hit 23 fantasy points in 3 straight games. That's good. And then we look at the matchup. The past 10 games, Washington has allowed 66 more passing yards per game to quarterbacks compared to that quarterback's season-long average. Stafford's averaging 255 yards a game. That's actually lower than it should be because remember, he had the injury mid-season where he had a few games where he clearly wasn't himself, but still 255. We had 66. We're now at 321 passing yards. Right there, if that's a rough baseline for Stafford, given the matchup, I get very excited. And then if we look, Vegas agrees. They love this. Only the San Francisco 49ers have a higher implied team total this week than the Rams, 27.5 points. I think 300 passing yards, multiple passing touchdowns are in store for Matthew Stafford this week.
Josh, I'm gonna veer a little bit here on you. Stafford's over-under passing yards is 264.5. Are we betting that right now?
Yes, when the show ends, I will definitely be betting that. And I'll see if there's a good line for maybe like plus 180, plus 200 for him to reach 300 yards as well. So good call.
On the player prop happy hour tomorrow, Stafford over 264.5 passing yards will be a mutual play for me and Josh. Next up, Josh, Patrick Mahomes. You have him at quarterback 9. He's quarterback 6 in consensus. I'd rather play Stafford than Mahomes this week too, but I'm curious what you're thinking about with the great one here.
Yeah, the great one. Not very great for fantasy so far this year. Mahomes has reached 18 fantasy points just once over the past 6 games. He's thrown for under 300 yards in all 6 games. He's thrown for 210 or fewer yards in 3 of his past 6. Ryan, as you know, the Chiefs defense is winning games for them this year. The Chiefs-Patriots game is a game total in the 30s. And the Chiefs team total is tied for just the 10th highest of the weekend. Vegas isn't even treating them like an elite offense. So me having Patrick Mahomes at quarterback 9 is actually higher than what Vegas is giving this team total. It's because the Patriots don't muster offense, and teams don't need to muster offense against them in return. Patriots, when you adjust for schedule, are secretly the 3rd toughest matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. Quarterbacks are scoring 3 fewer fantasy points per game against the Patriots than their season-long average. And I think there's 8 better options than Mahomes this week.
Next up, Josh, Kyler Murray. You have him at quarterback 11 against the 49ers, no less. Consensus has him as quarterback 15. Why are you higher than consensus on Murray in this matchup, Josh?
So first off, the Niners defense has actually been filled with injuries. I'm going to ask you about that later in the show, and you can run through some of those injuries for the good people. In general, we've identified this as an interesting game environment to target in our fantasy football playoffs guide that we co-authored. It's free on the 33rdteam.com. It is my pinned tweet at JLarkyTweets. It's probably the best piece we've written together this year. Kyler Murray's had at least 18 fantasy points 3 of his 4 games this year. The one time he was under it was against the Steelers because the Steelers simply couldn't score. Arizona just ran the ball. James Conner had a massive game, and Kyler Murray attempted just 23 passes. I do expect the Niners to put up some good offense. I do expect Kyler to give you 18 to 23 fantasy points. I think he's a low-end fantasy quarterback 1 this week. He's running. He has at least 6 carries, 3 or 4 games. This is just the profile of someone that we should be starting as a top 12 option.
Yeah, I know. I don't think the Cardinals are going to cover by a lot, but I think they're going to cover this week myself. Montgomery, you have him at running back 5. Consensus has him at running back 15. I think I know why you're leaning in this direction. I already agree with you, but tell the people where you're at here, Josh.
Yeah, we'll call this don't overthink it. The Broncos are the best fantasy matchup for running backs. The Lions are 4.5-point favorites. In positive or neutral game script, Montgomery is the hammer for Detroit. He is the guy that gets the carries. He's going to have 15 to 20 carries. He's going to have a couple targets. He's going to score once or twice. Montgomery is second in the NFL right now with over 4 red zone carries per game. The Broncos are, as I mentioned, not just the best fantasy matchup for running backs, but they allow the third most red zone rush attempts per game to opposing running backs. Betting markets have David Montgomery at minus 140 or better odds across the sports books to score a touchdown. His total yards prop is at 78.5 with pretty heavy juice to the over. I don't understand why you would ever not start David Montgomery. So I wanted to rank him as if you legally have to start him this week.
Yeah, I agree. You legally are required to start David Montgomery if you got him. Next up, Keaton Mitchell. You have him at running back 36. Consensus has him at running back 28. I like this, but want to hear your thoughts, Josh.
Ryan, this is like my Justin Jefferson stance last week. This is my strongest stance of the week. Keaton Mitchell is a sit, folks. He is a sit in the start-sit column. Ryan and I co-author. I wrote him up as well. In Keaton Mitchell's illustrious NFL career, he has never reached 10 carries in a game. He's averaging 1 reception per game. You might be like, well, what's his high water mark? He had 2 receptions in a game, just 1 game. All the other games, he had 1 or 0. Last week, he ran fewer routes than Gus Edwards and Justice Hill. Contrary to people who think his role is being expanded, his role shrank after the Week 13 bye. He doesn't get goal line work. That's Gus Edwards. He's facing a tough Jacksonville Jaguars run defense that allows only 3.7 yards per carry and the third fewest rush yards per game to running backs at only 66. He's averaging fewer than 10 PPR fantasy points a game. He's reached 14 fantasy points in just 1 of 6 games, so the ceiling is rare. The past 4 games, he has had 4, 9, 11, 10 touches. And he's put up 13, 5, 11, 7 fantasy points. What the heck are we doing, people? This is not the RB28.
That's Jay Larky tweets. Next up, Josh. Amari Cooper, you got him at wide receiver 17. He's wide receiver 26 across the industry. What are you thinking with Cooper here, Josh?
Cooper just had 14 targets. That was a 33% target share. He had 172 air yards, so his targets were not just voluminous, but they were deep down the field. Flacco's had at least 250 passing yards and 2 touchdowns in both of his starts. I looked at the weather in Cleveland. According to SportsGrid, temperature should be in the 50s. Wind should be 7 to 8 miles an hour. There is a 15% chance of rain. This is not a scary game environment. That is not how it's shaping up to be. The Bears, yes, they've been a solid pass defense recently, but ultimately I just want to bet on a talented receiver who's getting very, very heavy volume from a competent quarterback.
Next up, Josh. Adam Thielen, you've been down on him for a few weeks now. That's been aging pretty well. You have him at wide receiver 39. He's wide receiver 34 across the industry. Tell us about the once super productive Adam Thielen.
Yeah, the first 6 games, he averaged 21 fantasy points a game. Oh, wow. He was basically Keenan Allen. These next 7 games, the mid-30s veteran has struggled. He's averaging 45 yards a game. He's averaging under 10 fantasy points a game the past 7 games. In fact, rookie Jonathan Mingo's out-targeted him now. Each of the past 3 games, wide receiver rooms versus the Falcons average 5.5 fewer fantasy points per game than expected when you adjust for schedule. That's the 3rd toughest matchup. And Ryan, you probably know this, but I think some of the listeners are going to have their mind blown. The Panthers passing offense has been so unwatchable the past 6 games, and I don't think people realize. I'm going to list the passing stats over the past 6 weeks. I mean, I don't know if I've seen a stretch like this since like a Tim Tebow. Week 9, 173 passing yards, 1 touchdown. Week 10, 185 yards, no touchdowns. Week 11, 123 passing yards, 1 touchdown. Week 12, 194 yards, no touchdowns. Week 13, 178 yards, no touchdowns. Week 14, 137 yards, no touchdowns. The past 6 games, they have been under 200 passing yards with 2 total passing touchdowns. How can you start anyone in this pass attack?
You can't. I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was quite that bad, though. Next up, Josh, my favorite one on this list was Matthew Stafford. This is my second favorite one. You have T. Higgins ranked as your 51st wide receiver. Consensus has him as wide receiver 35. Why are you so down on T. Higgins, Joe?
I mean, oh boy, what a discrepancy. Wide
I know.
receiver 35, you start that guy. Folks,
Mhm.
Jake Browning the past 2 weeks has an average throw depth of 4.5 yards. That's the lowest in the NFL by about 33% when you look at the qualified starters. As we know, T. Higgins is generally working deep downfield. And you might be like, well, how does it translate in reality? The 2 games with Jake Browning, Higgins had 3 targets, and then he had 4 targets. Under double-digit fantasy points, both those games. It's tough to succeed without target volume and with a quarterback who doesn't want to push the ball downfield. The Vikings defense has played very well recently. T. Higgins is the clear wide receiver 2 in this offense, the wide receiver 2. I looked at the past 4 weeks because the Vikings defense has played pretty well. They've been getting better and better. The past 4 weeks, no wide receiver 2 has reached 60 yards against the Vikings. And the wide receiver 2s and offenses have averaged just 7 PPR fantasy points per game against the Vikings. T. Higgins is my wide receiver 51 for a reason. He hasn't done it yet with Browning. None of the peripherals suggest it's going to happen. And I think he has to wait at least 1 more week for it to happen.
Yeah, I think a 3-catch, 45-yard game would almost be a plus game for him in this matchup personally. So I'm with you too. I didn't draft much of Higgins, but if I did, I'd sit him for a number of guys this week.
Yeah, we might talk about him on the player prop happy hour tomorrow too. I'm curious to dive in more to his receiving yards line, but it's either going to be an under or a pass for me there.
Like that. Next up, Josh, Dalton Kincaid. You have him as tight end 7. He's tight end 10 across the industry. What are you thinking with Kincaid this week?
So Dawson Knox returned from injury last week. Didn't affect Kincaid. Some were very worried. I was at least skeptical of Kincaid's role last week, and it turned out not to matter. He still led the team with 42 routes run, second behind Stephon Diggs with 8 targets. This Cowboys-Bills game is the highest game total of the week. It's 50.5 points. The Bills are the favorites in this game. They themselves have the 3rd highest team total of the week, behind only the Niners and the aforementioned Rams. When you adjust for schedule, this was a sneaky one. Tight ends against Dallas actually score more fantasy points than their season-long average. That was very interesting to me. Now, I take these metrics with a grain of salt compared to like the receiver or the running back fantasy points metrics, but it is worth noting that it's not like this is some terrifying matchup on paper, which I think is good. We think Kincaid's talented. I know you bet on his receiving yards over last week, and I think that's kind of a bad beat when he has 8 targets, 5 catches, and can't muster the 39 yards you needed. I think this week he has a much better game.
Yeah, I'm with you across the board there, pal. With you across the board. You can find Josh's fantasy rankings on the website right now, the33team.com. Him, Kev Wheeler, Matthew Hill. I throw in some defensive rankings. We update them throughout the week. We'll also be in Discord this week. I'll hop in tonight for any sit questions you have tonight. Hopefully you don't have to rely on any Chargers or Raiders in this environment, but if you do, I'll hop in around 6 p.m. Eastern tonight. Last ranking question here, Josh. You have Pat Freiermuth at tight end 18. He's tight end 14 across the industry. What are you thinking here with the Steelers tight end?
Ryan, the Steelers simply don't trust Mitchell Trubisky. Even when trailing against the Patriots last week, Trubisky sucks. He couldn't even reach 200 passing yards. It was the dream game script. Couldn't do it. The Colts, as a defense, that's who they're facing, have the 3rd most sacks and the 3rd most forced fumbles on defense. That sounds like bad news for Trubisky. I don't think he gets enough pass volume to satiate someone like Pat Freiermuth. The past 2 games with Mr. Mitch Trubisky, Freiermuth has actually done really well. He's tied for the team lead with 19 and 20% target shares in those 2 games, which only resulted in 12 targets over 2 games. That's not a lot. 6 catches, 47 total yards. I just don't see the streamer appeal for Freiermuth like consensus does this week. I think he's kind of a low floor, low ceiling option. And I'd probably feel differently if it was Pickett under center. Trubisky, this offense is just, as you know, it's markedly different.
Yeah, it's a shame. I could see Trubisky not being on a team next year. That's where we're at right now. Next section, Josh, it's week 15. We want to help you guys get to your fantasy championship. We're going to talk about some flex plays, some streamers. First one, Josh, is a Sunday night game, a big one. Ravens, Jaguars, pretty good game. Odell Beckham at the Jaguars. Tell us about that one.
Beckham's had at least 97 yards 2 of his past 3 games. He led the team in targets 2 of these past 3 games. The Jaguars, as I mentioned earlier, allowed the 3rd fewest rush yards a game to running backs, but the 6th most receiving yards a game to receivers at 171 per game. And I think in most formats, if you have OBJ, he should be your wide receiver 3 or flex this week.
I like it. I agree. Jerome Ford versus the Bears, Josh.
So overall this year, when you adjust for schedule, the Bears are the 5th best matchup for fantasy running backs. Jerome Ford has at least 3 catches and 31 receiving yards in both games with the immobile Joe Flacco. We talk at length about how these stationary veteran quarterbacks like Goff, Flacco just love to check the ball down. Overall this year, the Bears have actually allowed the most receiving yards per game to opposing running backs at 57. I looked at the past 4 games. Bears defense is improving, even over the past 4 games when they've played much better defense, still allowing the 9th most receiving yards a game to running backs. I'm going to be looking at the prop markets for Jerome Ford's receiving yards tomorrow to see what the line is at. And then Jerome Ford in his own right has at least 12 fantasy points in each of his past 6 games. He's going to be in my RB2 slot in a few leagues this week.
God, that I'm making this move, calling in the righty here on one of my teams, $500 entry league. I'm giving JSN the start. You had him on the list of options you gave me for this. I was thrilled that you did because I think he has pretty good upside. Tell us about JSN against the Eagles.
Yeah, last week I talked at length about how it was not JSN week. A lot of people wanted it to be JSN week. It was not. He's now been held to just 6 catches for 66 yards over 2 games against the Niners. But this week against the Eagles, folks, it's different. The Eagles are the best matchup for fantasy receivers. Fantasy wide receiver rooms average 10 fantasy points higher than expected across the receiver room. 10 more fantasy points, even when you adjust for schedule. That is the best matchup. Smith and Jigba's target share has been at least 23% each of the past 2 weeks. So now he gets the roles increasing, and we finally have the matchup we like. Eagles have been the best run defense in the NFL in fantasy. It's a pass funnel defense. I think there's some fringe fantasy wide receiver 3 viability with JSN. And I think there's 20 fantasy points upside in this matchup.
Yeah, if you have a start specific question with JSN, hop in our Discord. I'll get through them on Saturday. Josh will be in there. Kev Wheeler's a killer in there too. We'll answer those specifically. Now I got a question for you, Josh. Here's we saw Jordan Love beat the Chiefs and the Lions. Then last Monday night we saw it was windy in Giant Stadium. I'll give him that. I also think this offense is different without Christian Watson. But Jordan Love wasn't very good last Monday. He's been up and down all year, if we're being honest. Are you streaming him against the Bucks?
Yeah, it's because it's the Bucks. I am a little concerned. We've talked before about how Christian Watson's been like frustrating for fantasy, but for real football, it's clear that he makes a big impact and that having a big, fast receiver on the outside generally matters. Quarterbacks against Tampa Bay this year average 19 fantasy points a game. That's number 4. When you adjust for schedule, they're still the 9th best matchup. You can basically add 2 fantasy points to whatever a quarterback's season-long average is, and that's what you should expect for them facing the Bucks. Quarterbacks average 281 yards a game against the Bucks. The Buccaneers, if we remove Will Levis and Bryce Young because they stink, then they've given up at least 250 passing yards over the past 9 games to the 7 non-Levis Young quarterbacks. I think Love is a pretty safe bet for 250, 260 passing yards, 1 to 3 passing touchdowns. He's another guy where I'll look at the prop markets as those lines come out later this week. And I think I might take a little long shot. We could probably get like a plus 200 for him to reach 250 passing yards after what we saw last week. And I think that's something I'd be very interested in.
Me too.
Ryan, let's change up the tables. Let's stick with quarterbacks. You're on the hot seat now. So let's talk about this Bengals team more. So I talked about how Jake Browning has the lowest average throw depth in the NFL. He's facing a blitz-happy Vikings team. Is this going to be a repeat of that primetime Bears-Vikings game where the Bears threw a dozen screen passes to at least some success? Or is this in no way carrying over? You're noticeably lower on consensus than Jake Browning. How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I watch every game for a reason. We talked about this on Monday. Roughly 120 of Jake Browning's 270 passing yards per short passes to running back. So I either talked to Jordan or my buddy Nick about this, which is a compliment to both you guys if you're listening. I have mixed feelings about Zach Taylor. On some levels, I think Joe Burrow could do better, from a play calling standpoint. However, I've seen a number of great opponent-specific game plans from Taylor over the years. In fact, I'm usually all over Joe Mixon's huge weeks because they're logical and they make sense. So in this instance, you mentioned the Bears game. People were up in arms and they're throwing so many screens. And, while Luke Getsky went a little overboard trying to mitigate the Brian Flores' blitz, there's 2 real ways that you can mitigate pass rush. short passes, particularly the screen game. You catch them in a screen, you get numbers, you can create big plays in that scenario. Or you have a quarterback like Peyton Manning that just shreds the opposing team when they try to blitz them. Justin Fields is not Peyton Manning, so they went with the screen game. So yes, I do think Jake Brown or Zach Taylor is going to deploy a quick game, screen-centric game plan. Not sure how much success they have, but yes, I'm expecting another game of low average depth for Jake Browning.
Folks, Ryan watches every snap of every game. He's done this since 2014. Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Today's Thursday. His expert picks and predictions for every game are on the33rdteam.com. On Saturday, he'll let you know exactly what he's betting on in each and every game. And tomorrow, we will host the Player Prop Happy Hour together, giving you some player prop bets for the good people. Now, Ryan, we hinted at the 49ers defense. There's a litany of recent injuries. Drop a couple of these recent injuries and how concerned people should be if they are 49ers defense and special teams fantasy managers out there.
Yeah, there's safety, Talona, Hafunga. I'm not as good at pronunciation with these things as Josh is, but he's a very good player. He's on IR. That's a problem. Eric Armstead and Javon Hargrave are not on IR, but they're questionable right now. The 49ers at full strength have the best pass rush in the league. They're deep. They have stars at every spot. But if both of those guys miss, their interior is an entirely different ball game. So that's a big one to watch for in any matchup. Dre Greenlaw is a stud. He plays next to Fred Warner. And, Travarius Ward's is also questionable. So in these situations, if even half of these guys miss, that reduces the talent gap between San Francisco and Arizona. So I'm a little bit, skeptical about this week. I'd probably move them back if these injuries stick. Next week against Baltimore, I'm going to probably look for someone else. But week 17 against the Commanders, I still view this as a full go, most likely.
I like that. Yeah, I looked at the practice report yesterday. I believe 8 defensive starters did not practice yesterday for the Niners. Now, with what we've seen these past 2 games and with the news of how Josh Dobbs has been demoted, Josh Dobbs is now the quarterback 3 in Minnesota. It is Nick Mullins as the starter. 5th round pick out of BYU. Rookie Jaron Hall is now the number 2. Dobbs again, number 3. It's been terrible to watch these last couple games. Can we now stream defenses against the Vikings and just treat this team like a bottom 10 offense?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, I do think they're a bottom 10 offense. Yes, I think you can stream just about anyone, especially this week. Like Lou Anarumo is an excellent defensive coordinator. He's, Nick Mullins is a below average backup. The one caveat I'll say is the Vikings do have a good offensive line, but, no Justin Jefferson. You hated Alexander Madison since preseason. He's out. The running game is a non-existent running game. So my answer is yes. I think you can stream just about anyone against Minnesota right now.
One more defense question. Looking at the Ravens. So they have 3 premium offenses that they face. They're in Jacksonville this week. Then they're in San Francisco next week. And then they have a home game, but they bring in the Dolphins. I assume you're most concerned with that week 16 matchup against the Niners because the Niners simply score points and don't turn the ball over. Give us a cheap substitution option for week 16. A lot of teams out there with the Ravens might have a bye or they just want to plan ahead. So what's a widely available week 16 defense so they can just avoid that matchup entirely?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know after the Jets game, people probably dropped Houston. Houston could be dicey this week against the Titans too because they're going to be on the field all day with Davis Mills if Davis Mills has to start. So Houston versus the Browns at home, I think it's decent. I'd rather play the Packers at Carolina, though. Green Bay's in the wild card hunt. They're going to be highly motivated, going to have a pass rush advantage. Josh just listed some of the most horrifying passing game statistics I've ever heard for a 5-game stretch.
So bad.
I think I'm rolling with the Packers if out of options that might actually be available right now.
I like that. Ryan, I'm not going to hold it against you. It was not a 5-game. That was actually a 6-game stretch of not reaching 200 yards. It's awful.
Even more disgusting.
All right, I'll let you take a sip of water. Ryan, stretch out, relax for a second, because now you're back on the clock, because we're going to talk about the AFC playoff picture. Folks, next week we'll discuss the NFC playoff picture in depth. Now, the wild cards are so interesting. Right now we have the 5th seed is the Browns. They're 8-5. 6 and 7 seeds are the Steelers and Colts. They're both 7-6. Outside looking in are the Bengals, the Texans, the Broncos, and the Bills. All 4 of those teams are also 7-6. That is 6 total teams that are 7-6. Who are the wild cards? Because right now we have the Browns, who look pretty firmly entrenched in that spot, and then 6 identical records behind them.
Yeah, Cleveland's in the driver's seat. They play a few tough teams, but I think they get in. Then I'm going to go through schedules here, Josh. Bengals versus Vikings, at Steelers, at Chiefs versus Browns. That could be 1-3. I don't think they're getting in. I think the last 2 games are kind of false wins, if you will. Give them credit for them, obviously, but I don't think the Bengals are a very good team. Pittsburgh at Indy versus the Bengals, at Seattle, at Baltimore. That looks like 2-2 at best. Maybe 1-3 with Mitch Trubisky. 0-4 is not off the table since Mitch Trubisky's at quarterback. So gonna X out the Steelers here. Houston at Tennessee, which is a problem if Davis Mills starts. I think that's the big thing here is if they lose this game because of Davis Mills, that probably knocks them out. Versus Cleveland versus Tennessee at Indy. The big one there is at Indy. Could end up being, those teams that could be a winner get in for both of those games. But right now, if Davis Mills starts this week, I don't think Houston gets in. Indy versus Pittsburgh at Atlanta versus the Raiders versus Houston. I don't think any team's a gimme for Indianapolis. That looks like 2-2 for me. I think they miss now. And the 2 teams that I think get in, I think Denver gets in. At Detroit, probably a loss this week, but versus the Patriots, first Easton Sticks Chargers, and then at the Raiders, I think Denver's going to finish 10-7. And then Buffalo, I'm a put your money where your mouth is guy. I have the Bills 6th in my power rankings. I think they're very dangerous. They've missed so many games by 1 score very narrowly, but their schedule versus Dallas, coin flip game. I think Buffalo wins, but again, coin flip game at Easton Sticks Chargers versus the Patriots at Miami. I think if they go 3-1, they're going to get in, and I think they're going to go 3-1.
Ryan, that's music to my ears because I've been doing a lot of those playoff basketball tournaments.
Yeah.
And on Underdog, I'd recommend those. I have been stacking Bills like nobody's business. They still go in the final half of the rounds. Almost every team that I have right now has Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs, James Cook, and then either Gabe Davis or Dalton Kincaid. So I love to hear that. I think people are sleeping on them. And like you said, when you lay out those schedules, it all begins to make sense. Now, I think one thing that's interesting, a team we haven't talked about that is no sure thing right now is the Jacksonville Jaguars. They're 8-5, but we have the Texans and Colts in the same division at 7-6. Suddenly the AFC South, after many years of mediocrity, looks quite interesting. Do you think they can hold on? Because there's only 1 game of separation right here.
Yeah, they host Baltimore on Sunday Night Football this week. They beat Baltimore by a point last year. Let's generously call this a coin flip game that Baltimore probably wins. So, but after that, at Tampa versus the Panthers at Tennessee, they should go 3-0 down the stretch. So even if they lose this week, I think they're probably taking home the AFC East, or the AFC South rather.
Now, what about the Dolphins? They're 9-4. They're 2 games ahead of the Bills right now, but you made the case for the Bills and the case against the Dolphins. Tyreek Hill has a sprained ankle, and they just lost to the Titans.
That's the thing, Josh. Here's, it's the same situation as the 49ers right now. Left tackle Taron Armstead, questionable. Center Liam Eichenberg, questionable. Right guard Robert Hunt, doubtful. Austin Jackson, right tackle, questionable. If they're down 4 offensive linemen, Tua is one of those quarterbacks that's pressure sensitive. He needs stability in the pocket. Drew Brees needed stability in the pocket, so that's not really a huge knock on Tua. There's been a lot of excellent pocket passers. But we've been saying this for weeks. When the timing's a big factor for the Dolphins, and when you throw it off a little bit, it's like the whole operation falls apart. And like you said, even if Tyreek Hill guts through this ankle sprain, he's probably not quite Tyreek Hill right now. So I think Miami could definitely lose to Buffalo in the last week of the season. They could definitely lose to Dallas. If they lose and then they also play the Ravens in Baltimore. So 1-3 with the Jets on deck this week is not out of the question for Miami.
Have you seen what the odds are for the Bills to win the division? Because this makes me interested in a long shot if the odds are good.
It was plus 300 a few days ago, but I wasn't sure. I know I'm thinking about doing a 49ers Bills Super Bowl where the 49ers win. So that's something I'll talk about that tomorrow, actually.
I like the sound of that. Let's talk about the Chiefs. What are a couple things they need to fix these next few weeks? They're 8-5. They face 4 backup quarterbacks to close out the season. They're just fine, folks. They're just fine. They're going to win the division. I think it's going to be pretty easy for them, but they have much higher sights than just beating 4 backup quarterbacks. They want to make a playoff run. What are 1 or 2 things that they need to figure out over this next month?
One thing that I'd like to see is a return to the Andy Reid screen game. You know, they've kind of shelved that for the last few years for the most part. They had great success with it in Philly. Andy Reid's like the best screen designer ever, really. So since the wide receivers aren't really helping them out, I'd like to see that. And, you know, you need more out of Rashee Rice right now. He needs to step up and be more of the guy right now, because I don't think anyone else on that roster is really capable of it.
Folks, we have one last question for Ryan. It's a spicy one. But before we get to that, reminder to follow him at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Check out on Mondays his Survivor thoughts. Tuesdays, his NFL power rankings. Thursdays, his picks and predictions for every game. Friday, the two of us do the player prop happy hour. And on Saturdays, he lets you know what he's betting on in each and every game. And scattered throughout the end of the week, you're going to get a few island game matchup previews like the Thursday, Sunday, Monday night games. He's a busy man. He watches every snap of every game. He's worth following. And anything he says, you should pay attention to. My fantasy rankings are on the site, the33rdteam.com. The playoff fantasy football guide that the two of us co-authored is on the site as well. It's my pinned tweet at JLarkyTweets. All right, Ryan, get us out of here. We're diving into the NFC playoff picture next week. The folks want something, just a little sneak peek right now. Give us a bold take on a surging NFC team.
You know, Josh, I'm a mild enthusiast about the Chicago Bears. I've been above consensus on them for a while now. And you know, that's starting to age well. They're 2-1 since Justin Fields came back. I think they're going to go into Cleveland and win an ugly game as 3-point road underdogs. You know, the Browns are both down both of their offensive tackles. One of my tenets in football is you can get away with playing effective offense with one liability offensive tackle. It becomes very hard when you have two. That's the situation Cleveland's in. Joe Flacco's the most immobile quarterbacks in the league right now. Montez Sweat's transformed the Bears pass rush. Chicago has at least a borderline top 10 defense right now. And like I said with Flacco, he brings stability to the offense, but I don't think we should be counting on him shredding teams for 300 yards in the air with any consistency. I think that stops this week against the Bears.
Folks, you heard it. Bears, sneaky playoff contender. From myself, Josh Larky. From Bears enthusiast Ryan Reynolds. We represent the 33rd team. This is week 15. Thank you, everyone.